Okay, jumping into this deep dive, we're tackling Michel Serres Rameaux. These excerpts, wow, they've got me thinking about how formats shape history in ways I never considered.
It's amazing how Serres takes something as abstract as a format and makes it feel so real, so tangible. It's like he's giving us a new lens to see the world through.
I know, right? Like, I usually think about formatting a document or something, but Serres is talking about systems of order that build entire civilizations.
Exactly.
He uses the example of standardized measurements during the Renaissance. Imagine, trying to trade back then, when every town had its own system of weights and measures.
Right. It would have been chaos.
Total chaos.
Yeah, it would have stifled economic growth, that's for sure.
That standardization, the way those systems were formatted, allowed for complex trade and the exchange of ideas on a global scale. It's like, without that formatting, the Renaissance wouldn't have even been possible.
Exactly. It was essential.
Okay, so we've got these formats creating order, but then Serres throws events into the mix. Help me unpack this a bit. What exactly is an event in Serres' view?
Well, think of them as those shock waves that disrupt the established order, the formats we've been talking about. Imagine something like, the bursting of the Bosphorus, which Serres actually talks about.
Okay.
That single event led to the formation of the Black Sea. Talk about a disruptive change. It reshaped geography, trade routes, even, the course of empires.
Whoa. Okay, I see what you mean. But that feels almost random, doesn't it? How does that kind of randomness fit into this idea of formats shaping history?
That's where it gets really interesting. See, Serres uses examples like the Bosphorus, or even asteroid impacts that cause those mass extinction events, to highlight how unpredictable the consequences can be. These events completely reshape history, the evolution of life itself, in ways that nobody could have predicted. It's this interplay, this kind of tension between these rigid formats and these chaotic events that shapes everything.
It's not just about the event itself. It's about how it throws a wrench into the works, how it disrupts the existing order.
Precisely.
And it makes you realize just how much of history is this kind of dance between these two forces.
Yeah.
Speaking of history, Serres connects this to how we understand knowledge itself, right? Like how we know what we know.
Absolutely. He talks about scientific discoveries that completely overturn those established theories. Take the shift from Newtonian physics to quantum mechanics, for example. Talk about an event in the world of knowledge.
Right.
It totally changed how we understood the universe.
It's like our whole understanding of reality shifted. And then there's the rise and fall of empires, right? And the constant emergence of new technologies that change everything overnight. And massive cultural shifts. It's like this constant push and pull between, order and disruption, wouldn't you say?
Exactly. And this isn't just some abstract historical process. What Serres wants us to see is how the same interplay, the same push and pull between formats and events plays out in our own lives, in the everyday.
Okay, so how do we even begin to make sense of this in our own experiences? It seems so big.
Well, this is where Serres' metaphor of the father and the son comes in, and it's actually more nuanced than it might seem at first glance.
I was curious about that. He talks about this shifting from father to son. What's the deal with that?
Okay, so think of the father as that traditional, almost authoritarian approach to knowledge deduction, absolutes, certainty. It's all about imposing order on the world, much like those formats we were talking about earlier. Imagine a world run by strict rules, a world with no room for questioning. That's the father at play.
Okay, I think I see where you're going with this. So the son would be more rebellious.
In a way, yes. The son represents this more humble, more experimental approach to knowledge. It's about induction, about uncertainty, acknowledging that we don't have all the answers, which of course aligns perfectly with the unpredictable nature of those events we were discussing.
So instead of blindly accepting the old formats, those pronouncements from on high, we're being encouraged to think for ourselves, to actually embrace the uncertainty of it all.
Precisely. And it's interesting, it mirrors the evolution of scientific thought itself. We're moving away from this need for absolute certainty and towards embracing uncertainty and contingency, that element of chance, the unknown.
It's a bit unsettling, to be honest.
I bet it.
But also kind of exciting when you think about it. So if we acknowledge that we're constantly being shaped by these unforeseen events, does that mean that we have the power to shape them too?
Now that is the question that Serres really grapples with throughout Rameaux. He talks about the rising importance of acknowledging contingency, the role of chance in our lives, even in the universe itself.
Which leads us to this idea of the algorithmic over the declarative. which, to be honest, sounds a bit intimidating at first.
It's actually pretty simple when you break it down. Think of the declarative as those big sweeping statements about how the world works, the earth is flat, humans are at the center of the universe, those kinds of bold declarations.
I get it. Big, absolute statements.
Right. The algorithmic, on the other hand, is about focusing on those specific, detailed narratives. It's about recognizing that there are often a multitude of factors that contribute to any given outcome.
So instead of saying, like, gravity makes things fall, we're looking at all those tiny variables like air resistance, the shape of the object, all those nuances.
Precisely. And what's fascinating is that Serres sees this shift towards the algorithmic, reflected in our increasing reliance on technology and data analysis, or moving away from those grand narratives and towards a more nuanced, more data-driven understanding of how the world actually works.
Which, of course, brings us to the big question. Yeah. The future. How does Serres see the future playing out in this world of formats and events? It's kind of a lot to wrap your head around, this whole idea.
Well, what's so fascinating about Serres is that he doesn't see the future as this, predetermined thing. He sees it as this vast, constantly shifting landscape of possibilities. And those possibilities, they're shaped both by our choices and by those unpredictable events that we were talking about earlier, the ones that are always, lurking around the corner.
So we're not just along for the ride. We're actually helping to steer the ship in a way.
Exactly. And he introduces this really intriguing concept called naturance.
Naturance, go on.
Yeah, and it suggests that humanity is actually becoming an active participant in evolution itself.
Wait, hold on. We're not just talking about, biological evolution here.
Well, I've done it. Naturance encompasses both biological and technological evolution. Think about it. We are shaping the future of our species and the planet, really, through our technological innovations. I mean, we're on the verge of potentially altering our own genetic code, developing artificial intelligence that could surpass our own, maybe. This is, it's unprecedented in human history.
Okay, my mind is officially blown. But this raises, a pretty big question, doesn't it? If we have this much power, this much influence over the future, what about the ethical implications?
That's the crux of it, right? And Serres definitely doesn't shy away from that. He wants us to really think critically about the choices we're making, to be aware of the potential consequences, both the ones we intend and the ones we don't. He doesn't shy away from the responsibility that comes with having this kind of power, this kind of influence.
It's a lot to ponder. This whole thing, it makes me think of like a tapestry. It's like the future is this massive tapestry woven from countless threads, each one representing a choice, an event, the possibility. We're all contributing to this ever-evolving work of art. But here's the thing. We can't always see the full picture, can we?
That's a beautiful way to put it. And that's really the challenge that Serres lays out for us, I think, to become more conscious, more intentional weavers of this tapestry, to really think about the kind of future we want to create and then to act accordingly.
It's almost like a cosmic call to action. But where do we even begin? How do we become those intentional weavers when there's so much uncertainty, so much it's completely outside of our control? It feels a bit overwhelming if you really let yourself think about it.
It can be overwhelming, but I think it starts by recognizing the power of those seemingly small choices that we make every single day. Each one is like a thread in that tapestry you were talking about, contributing to the larger pattern, the overall design. Never underestimate the butterfly effect. Even those small actions, those seemingly insignificant choices, can have ripple effects that extend far beyond what we can even imagine.
So even those small decisions, those everyday choices, could ripple outward and have a much larger impact than we realize. That's both, daunting and empowering at the same time, wouldn't you say?
Exactly. It's about paying attention to the connections, understanding how our actions, however small, can influence the course of events. And that's where I think Serres' ideas become so practical. It's about recognizing those formats in our own lives, those habits, those routines, those systems that we've created, and then seeing where we can introduce those sun moments, those moments of disruption and innovation that we were talking about.
This is starting to feel almost spiritual, if that makes sense. Like this interconnected web of cause and effect where we all play a part, no matter how small.
There's definitely a philosophical depth to Serres' work. He's asking us to reconsider our place in the universe, to see ourselves as both products, A&D producers of this grand unfolding story. It's about recognizing our agency in a world that often feels, let's face it often feels defined by forces that are totally outside of our control.
It's about stepping into that role of conscious creators, isn't it? Embracing the uncertainty, acknowledging our own agency, and then taking responsibility for the threads that we weave into the tapestry, for the choices we make, for the future we're creating.
That's the challenge and the beauty, I think, of Serres' work. He doesn't offer any easy answers, but he equips us with the tools to ask better questions. He pushes us to think more deeply about the forces that are shaping our lives and the choices that we make in the face of those forces.
Speaking of forces shaping our lives, what really stuck with me in these excerpts? The way Serres uses those vivid examples from history and nature to illustrate his points. Like that whole section about the bursting of the Bosphorus and the formation of the Black Sea. It's almost biblical in its scale and impact, wouldn't you say?
It's a fantastic example, and there are so many others. He uses these dramatic, almost mythical events to really drive his point home. He wants to shake us out of our complacency, to make us look at the world with fresh eyes. We get so used to our routines, to those formats that we create for ourselves, that we forget sometimes about the impact they have on the world around us.
And it worked. Reading that section, I suddenly became so aware of all the formats in my own life, the routines, the systems, even just like the things I do every day without even thinking about them. It's like suddenly noticing the air you breathe, You've never really paid attention to it before, but now you can't ignore it. It's just there.
That's a fantastic analogy, and it highlights the kind of double-edged nature of those formats. They provide order and stability, which we crave as humans, right? We like to know what to expect. But they can also be restrictive, even suffocating if we're not careful. Yeah. It's about finding that balance, and I think that's what Serres is urging us to do. Embrace the order, but don't lose sight of the potential for disruption, for innovation. Don't be afraid to shake things up a bit.
It's like walking a tightrope, isn't it? Between those two opposing forces, trying to find that sweet spot where we can benefit from structure without becoming trapped by it.
Precisely. And that's where the sun comes in again, remember. That spirit of experimentation, of questioning, of being open to new possibilities. It's about constantly evaluating those formats we've created for ourselves, those routines, those systems, those habits, and asking, do they still serve us? Or is it time for something new?
It's like we need to cultivate that sun energy within ourselves, that willingness to challenge those old rigid formats when they no longer serve us, but also to recognize the value that they provide, right? It's about finding that balance, that equilibrium point between, respecting tradition, but also embracing innovation, wouldn't you say?
Exactly. It's about recognizing that those formats, those traditions and structures, they often emerged from a very real need, a need for order, for stability. They served a purpose, and they might still. But we need to be willing to ask those tough questions. Are these structures still serving us? Are they hindering our growth in any way? Are they preventing us from adapting to a changing world? Because the world is constantly changing, isn't it?
That reminds me of another example Serres uses. Those extinction events caused by asteroids. Talk about an event. It's a stark reminder that sometimes those disruptions, those events, they can be catastrophic, right? They can come with a heavy price.
Absolutely. He doesn't downplay the destructive potential of those events. But what he's also saying, I think, is that even in those moments of destruction, there's also a seed of creation, a seed of something new emerging. Think about how those extinction events, as devastating as they were, they paved the way for the evolution of new species. New life forms emerged, including, eventually, our own. It's about recognizing the cyclical nature of history, of life itself, this ongoing cycle of death and rebirth.
It's like this cosmic cycle of death and rebirth playing out on this grand scale, and here we are right in the middle of it, being forced to adapt and evolve, just like everything else.
And Serres wants us to see ourselves as part of that cycle. We're not separate from it. We're woven into the very fabric of it. It's about recognizing that change is inevitable. It's going to happen whether we like it or not. And our ability to adapt, to evolve in the face of that change, that's what allows us to not just survive, but to thrive.
It's a humbling thought, but also kind of empowering when you really think about it. If we can understand those forces that are at play, those cycles of creation and destruction, maybe then we can learn to navigate them a bit better, to actually harness their energy for good, to create a better future for ourselves, for the planet.
That's the hope, isn't it? To become more conscious participants in this grand unfolding story, to use our knowledge and our agency to shape a future that's both beautiful and sustainable.
He even uses this incredibly powerful image, saying that, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he says something like, the world hurls in pain because it has begun its labor. It evokes this sense of, being on the precipice of something new, something transformative, but also recognizing that progress Well, progress isn't always pretty, is it?
It's a powerful image because it acknowledges the messy reality of progress. It's not always a straight line upwards. There are often setbacks, struggles, even moments, of despair. But within that struggle, that labor, lies the potential for something new, something extraordinary to be born. And I think Serres is urging us to embrace that process, to not shy away from the discomfort of change, but to lean into it, knowing that it's leading us towards something greater than ourselves and what we can even imagine in this moment.
And maybe that's where these deep dives, these conversations, come in handy. It's like we're getting a crash course in Serres' big ideas, a way to wrap our heads around these complex concepts and start to see how they actually apply to our own lives.
And hopefully it sparks a desire to delve even deeper, to explore these ideas further on your own, and to see how they resonate with your own experiences, your own aspirations.
I know, I'm definitely feeling that urge. This has been such a thought-provoking conversation.
And we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to unpack in Serres' work. Like his thoughts on the history of knowledge and how it relates back to this father-son dynamic we were discussing.
Right. He uses that metaphor to kind of trace the evolution of how we think, how we approach knowledge itself.
And he brings in these fascinating examples to illustrate his points. He talks about how in Raphael's painting, The School of Athens, Plato is depicted standing above Aristotle.
It's like even in art, we see this ingrained bias towards the father figure, the authority figure.
Yeah.
But Serres is challenging us to question that hierarchy, isn't he? He's saying, don't just take their word for it. Think for yourself.
Absolutely. And he argues that this bias, this reverence for the father, for authority, has really shaped how we've understood the world for centuries. But he also sees a shift happening, a move away from that blind faith in authority towards a more critical, more questioning approach, which of course aligns with the sun energy we were discussing earlier.
And he links this shift to the rise of experimental science, right? Like, instead of just accepting what the ancient philosophers said as gospel, we started testing things out for ourselves, observing the world, and drawing our own conclusions based on that evidence, on those experiences. We started to embrace the sun energy a bit more.
Precisely. And this shift from deduction to induction it's a key theme in Rameaux. It's about embracing the uncertainty, the messiness of the real world, instead of trying to impose our preconceived notions onto it. It's about acknowledging that our understanding of the world is constantly evolving. It's not static. Mm-hmm. And we need to be open to new information, new ways of seeing things, new ways of understanding if we want to truly learn and grow.
And that brings us back to the sun figure, doesn't it? The one who isn't afraid to get their hands dirty, to experiment, to learn through trial and error, to challenge the way things have always been done.
Exactly. It's about moving away from that rigid hierarchical view of knowledge, the father's view, towards something more fluid, more adaptable, more in tune with the ever-changing, constantly evolving nature of reality.
It's like the sun is saying, hey, I respect the wisdom of the father. I do. But I also need to find my own way, to explore the world for myself, to see things through my own eyes, to challenge the status quo, even if it makes people uncomfortable.
That's a great way to put it. And it's a message that resonates so strongly in our current era, where information is constantly evolving at an unprecedented rate, and we're constantly being challenged to rethink our assumptions, to question what we thought we knew.
And Serres gives us some pretty compelling examples of how this sun energy has actually driven scientific progress throughout history. He talks about thinkers like Werner Heisenberg, who developed the uncertainty principle in quantum mechanics.
Right, and Kurt Gödel.
Oh, and Gödel, of course, who proved that no formal system of logic can ever be truly complete.
These were groundbreaking discoveries, truly. Discoveries that shook the foundations of traditional knowledge. They challenged those long-held assumptions about certainty and order. But they embraced the sun energy, and in doing so, they changed the world as we knew it. They changed how we understand the universe, even reality itself.
And it wasn't always easy for those sons to get their ideas heard, was it? Like, they were often met with resistance, even ridicule from the established authorities, those who clung tightly to the father's way of thinking.
Oh, absolutely. Serres highlights the struggles of these innovators, those who dared to challenge the status quo and push the boundaries of knowledge. But he also celebrates their achievements, of course. He shows how their willingness to embrace the sun energy led to some truly incredible breakthroughs that have shaped the world we live in today.
He even mentions Blaise Pascal, who was like this mathematical prodigy as a kid.
Right.
And how even he was initially dismissed by some of the leading mathematicians of his time. It's a good reminder that those truly groundbreaking ideas, those ideas that have the power to change the world, they often come from unexpected places. And those sons of knowledge, those innovators, those disruptors, they often have to fight to be heard. They have to be willing to challenge the status quo and to face that resistance, that ridicule even, to get their ideas out into the world. But their contributions, well, they're what drive progress. They're what move us forward.
It's about recognizing that innovation often comes from challenging those established norms, from being willing to ask why, even when the answer seems obvious, even when everyone else is nodding along and saying, well, that's just how it is. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is to ask that simple question, why?
And those struggles, those moments of friction, between the father and the son, those are often what lead to those aha moments, those breakthroughs, those moments of sudden insight that have the power to change the course of history, wouldn't you say? It's like those clashes, those moments of friction, they force us to examine our assumptions, to look at things from a different perspective, and ultimately to find new and better ways of understanding the world.
Exactly. And Serres celebrates those moments of rupture, those disruptions that force us to rethink our understanding of everything. Now, he's not advocating for chaos, of course, but he recognizes that without those moments of disruption, we risk becoming stagnant. We risk becoming trapped by those outdated ways of thinking, those old formats that no longer serve us.
And he doesn't just limit this father-son dynamic to science, does he? Like, he sees it playing out in pretty much all areas of human endeavor, right?
Oh, absolutely. He talks about art, literature, religion, even politics.
It's like this universal pattern, this dance between the old guard, those fathers clinging to power, and the sons challenging that authority, bringing forth new ideas and new ways of seeing the world.
It's the cycle of history playing out across every field of human endeavor over and over again, and it will continue to play out, don't you think?
I think you're right. So with that in mind, let's take a deep dive into part 3.
Okay, yeah.
I think I need a minute to digest all of that. That's a lot to take in. Where were we?
We were talking about how even those seemingly insignificant events, those little disruptions to our routines, can actually be opportunities for growth and learning, how they can shake us out of our complacency and help us see the world with fresh eyes.
Right. And how we can get so used to those formats, those routines, those established ways of doing things that we kind of forget how much they're actually shaping our experience of the world.
Absolutely. And it's not that routines are inherently bad or anything. They provide structure, predictability, even comfort in a world that often feels chaotic and unpredictable. But I think what Serres is urging us to do is to at least become more aware of those structures, those formats, and to ask ourselves if they're still serving us or if they've maybe become, cages that are limiting our potential.
So how do we know when it's time to break free from a format, to shake things up a bit and embrace a little disruption? It's easy to say, question your routines, but it's a lot harder to actually do it, isn't it?
It's definitely a process. It's not always easy, and there's no one-size-fits-all answer, unfortunately. But I think it starts with just paying attention, with noticing those moments when we feel, stuck, stifled, or just uninspired by the way things are.
So, if my morning routine starts to feel less like a well-oiled machine and more like a hamster wheel I can't get off, that might be a sign that it's time to mix things up a bit.
Exactly. And it doesn't have to be this, this drastic overhaul. Sometimes it's the small things that make a difference. Maybe it's as simple as trying a new coffee shop, listening to a different podcast on your commute, or even just taking a different route to work. Just something to shake things up a bit.
It's about introducing those little events into our lives, those moments of disruption that kind of force us off autopilot and help us see things, see things with fresh eyes. It reminds me of something we were talking about earlier about how those events, as disruptive as they can be in the moment, often lead to those aha moments, those moments of insight and creativity where we suddenly see things in a new light.
It's like those disruptions actually create the space for something new to emerge. They shake up our thinking, they challenge our assumptions, and they kind of force us to come up with new solutions, new ways of seeing, new ways of being in the world. Think about it. Some of the greatest discoveries, inventions, even works of art throughout history, they emerged from moments of crisis, from moments of disruption, from breaking free from the established order.
So maybe instead of always fearing disruption, we should try to embrace it, at least a little bit. Not in a reckless way, of course, but as a catalyst for growth, for innovation, for pushing ourselves beyond those self-imposed comfort zones.
Exactly. And I think that's something that Serres would wholeheartedly agree with. Remember how he talks about the world, how he says, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he says something like, the world hurls in pain because it has begun its labor. It's a powerful image, isn't it? It speaks to the messy and often uncomfortable nature of progress. Real progress rarely happens without some struggle along the way. But within that struggle, that labor, lies the potential for something new, something extraordinary to be born. And Serres is urging us, I think, to embrace that process, to not shy away from the discomfort of change, but to lean into it, knowing that it's ultimately leading us towards something greater than we can imagine right now.
So maybe instead of resisting change so much, we should try to lean into it, even if it feels a bit uncomfortable at first. Because maybe, just maybe, it's actually leading us towards something better. Something bigger.
That's a fantastic takeaway. And it speaks to a certain courage, a willingness to embrace uncertainty, to trust that even if we don't have all the answers right now, even if we stumble or even fall flat on our faces along the way, we're still moving forward. We're still evolving, still becoming.
As you're talking, it occurs to me that, Serres's ideas, they're not just about understanding the world around us, are they? They're about understanding ourselves, our place in the grand scheme of things.
That's a really insightful point. I completely agree. I think at their core, his ideas really are about recognizing our agency, our ability to shape not only our own lives, but also the world around us. And I think that's an incredibly powerful and important message, don't you? Especially right now.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that we're all, in a sense, weavers of this grand tapestry of formats and events. We're constantly making choices, taking actions, and those choices have consequences. Those consequences ripple out and influence the patterns that emerge, the world we create.
And that's both an incredible responsibility and an incredible opportunity. We have the power to shape the future. We do. It's up to us to decide what kind of future we want to create.
Wow. We need a minute to process that thought.
Take your time.
But before we wrap things up, is there anything else from Rameaux that you think, we should touch on? We've covered a lot of ground here, but this book is so rich with ideas. I feel like we've only just scratched the surface.
We've only just scratched the surface, that's for sure. But there's one more passage that has really stuck with me that I think kind of encapsulates everything we've been talking about. Serres writes, "To invent is to discover what we are capable of doing."
Wow. That's really powerful. And it feels like such a fitting note to end on, don't you think? It's like he's reminding us that we are all capable of so much more than we often give ourselves credit for. That within each of us lies this incredible potential, this untapped potential for creativity, for innovation, for transformation.
And that potential, that amazing raw potential, is unleashed when we embrace those sun qualities that we've been talking about throughout this whole deep dive, It's about cultivating that curiosity, that courage to experiment, that willingness to not know all the answers, that humility to say, I don't know, but I'm willing to learn.
So maybe the real deep dive, when it comes down to it, isn't just into Serres' work, but into ourselves.
I love that.
It's about exploring our own potential, discovering what we're truly capable of achieving when we're brave enough to embrace the dance, the messy, chaotic, beautiful dance of formats and events. Because that dance, that's life, isn't it? It's everything.
You said it.
Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into Rameaux. And I have to say, I'm walking away, or I guess logging off, with this renewed sense of wonder and possibility, but also responsibility, And what about you?
As am I. And I want to thank you and everyone listening for joining us on this exploration. It's been a pleasure.
If you've enjoyed this deep dive, and we hope you have, be sure to check out Michel Serres Rameaux for yourself. Trust us, it's a wild ride. And until next time, keep those sun energies flowing. Let's see what incredible futures we can create together.